The scent of lemon polish still clings faintly to the air in this apartment, a ghost of the countless hours I spent kneeling on floors that were never truly mine, scrubbing away the accumulated dirt of lives I poured myself into. It's funny, isn't it? You give and give, you build and mend, you smooth edges and wipe away messes, and you think, just for a moment, that the structure you're building will hold you up when your own legs grow tired. You imagine hands reaching out steady and strong because you made them strong. You see faces looking back at you with the same quiet gratitude you felt just being able to provide. But sometimes, the very foundation you thought you laid crumbles not under the weight of time, but under the deliberate swing of a hammer wielded by a hand you once held inside your own. That's how it felt the day Daniel sat across from me, his tie perfectly knotted, his eyes, those eyes that used to sparkle with pure, uncomplicated joy at the sight of a homemade cookie, now cold and calculating, delivering words that sliced through the air like shards of glass. He wasn't angry, not in the way a child is angry after a scraped knee. This was different. This was transactional. He spoke about market rates, about the cost of maintenance, about fairness. Fairness. The word tasted like ash on my tongue. He owned this building now, a collection of apartments in the bustling part of town he'd always aspired to live in, far from the quiet, leafy street where he grew up. He'd bought it a few years ago, a smart investment, he'd called it, puffed up with the importance of it all. He'd offered me this small apartment on the ground floor. "So you can be close, Mom," he'd said, his voice smooth, persuasive. I'd sold the house then, the house where I'd raised him, and his sister, the house filled with ghosts of laughter and whispered secrets, because he made it sound like a new chapter, a way to simplify, a way to be near my children. My daughter Sarah lived across town, busy with her own young family, but Daniel was right here, just floors above me, or so I thought. The rent, he explained, starting next month would be substantial. Not a token amount, not covering just the bills, but a full-blown market rent. The kind of rent I couldn't possibly afford on my modest pension and the small amount left after selling the house. He laid it all out with the detachment of a businessman discussing quarterly reports, citing figures, percentages. He even had a printed document, a formal notice. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, the paper cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my chest. There was no preamble, no softening, no acknowledgement of the decades I had spent ensuring he had a roof over his head, food in his belly, clothes on his back, opportunity he wouldn't have had otherwise. Just the demand and the implicit threat hanging in the air. Pay up or leave. The betrayal wasn't just in the demand for money, though that was a cruel twist of the knife. It was in the erasure of everything that came before. It was in the reduction of our relationship, mother and son, to landlord and tenant. It was in the chilling realization that the boy I had nurtured, the man I had believed in, saw me not as a source of love and history, but as a financial liability, a potential income stream he had previously overlooked. I looked at his face, searching for a flicker of the boy who used to crawl into my lap after a bad dream, whose hand I held crossing the street, whose triumphs I celebrated as if they were my own. But all I saw was the man, hard-edged and calculating, his expression polite but firm. It was a mask I didn't recognize. It was a stranger wearing my son's face. The silence in the room after he finished speaking stretched, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the muffled sounds of his tenants moving about upstairs, people he treated, I assumed, with more respect than he was showing me. "Daniel," I managed, my voice a reedy whisper, barely audible. How can you ask this?" He sighed, a short, impatient sound that spoke volumes. "Mom, it's just business. This building isn't a charity. I have expenses. Property taxes are through the roof. Maintenance isn't cheap. It's only fair that everyone pays their way. Everyone." That word hung in the air too, isolating me, placing me firmly in the category of everyone, a tenant like any other, devoid of history, devoid of connection. Fairness. He used the word again like a shield. Was it fair that I'd work 2 jobs after his father left, just to keep us afloat? Was it fair that I'd foregone things I needed, things I wanted, so he could have the best education I could manage? Was it fair that I'd poured every ounce of my energy, my dreams, my very self, into raising him to be a good man, a kind man? The irony of him standing there, in a building he owned, demanding rent from the woman who had sacrificed everything so he could stand tall, was a bitter, corrosive thing. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion. It was the exhaustion of a love that had been taken for granted, of a lifetime of effort dismissed with a shrug and a business plan. He waited, his gaze unwavering, expectant. He wasn't asking, he was telling. And in that moment, sitting across from my son in this apartment he owned, I understood, with a clarity that chilled me to the core, that I was alone, truly, utterly alone. The safety net I thought I had woven with threads of love and sacrifice was an illusion. It had snapped, and I was falling. The shock didn't wear off quickly. It lingered in the air like the stale smell of a room closed up too long, heavy and suffocating. I spent the next few days in a haze, moving through the motions of everyday life, making tea, watering the small pot of basil on the windowsill, folding laundry, but my mind replayed Daniel's words, his tone, his eyes, over and over. It's just business. Everyone pays their way. It wasn't just the financial burden, although that was significant. The rent he proposed was more than half my monthly income. It was the principle.
It was the utter lack of acknowledgement for the past. It was the cold calculation that had replaced familial affection. I thought about the house I'd sold. It wasn't grand, but it was ours.
It held the echoes of Daniel's first steps, the height marks etched onto the kitchen doorframe, now painted over but still visible to me. It held the memory of him coming home from school, flinging his backpack down, talking a mile a minute about his day. I'd sold it partly because he presented this apartment as a better option, closer to him, easier for me. He'd even helped me manage the funds from the sale, suggesting investments that he claimed would provide a small but steady return. A return that now seemed laughable in the face of his rent demand. Had he planned this all along? Was selling the house part of some long-term strategy to gain control, to turn my assets into his income? The thought was so monstrous, so utterly soul-crushing, that I pushed it away, but it gnawed at the edges of my mind. Motherhood, I'd always believed, was a sacred trust. You bring a life into the world, you nurture it, you guide it, you prepare it to stand on its own 2 feet. You hope, with a fiercely protective love, that they will be kind, resilient, and happy. You don't expect payment for scraped knees kissed better, for sleepless nights spent by their bedside, for dreams deferred, for ambitions set aside. You do it because you love them, because they are a part of you, and you trust that that bond, that history, means something, that it provides a mutual safety, a foundation of unconditional regard. Daniel's demand had shattered that trust, exposing a chilling reality to him. I was no longer mother. I was a tenant, a potential revenue stream. The irony of him demanding rent in a building he could only afford, in part because of the sacrifices I had made, the foundation I had helped build for him, was a cruel, sharp pain. I remembered nights working late, coming home exhausted, still needing to make dinner, help with homework. I remembered saying no to things I wanted, year after year, because his needs came first. His tuition, his sports equipment, his first car, things that weren't strictly necessary, but felt important for his future, for his sense of belonging. Where was the accounting for that? Where was the market rate for a mother's unwavering support, for a lifetime of putting someone else's needs before your own? He spoke of fairness. Was it fair that he had inherited not just genes and history from me, but also indirectly the means to acquire this building? The money from the house sale hadn't vanished. It was invested, managed, And a portion of that, a significant portion I suspected, had contributed to his down payment, his renovations, his ability to stand there and demand rent from me. I looked around the small apartment. It was comfortable, clean, but it felt increasingly like a cage built and owned by my own son. Every object in it felt temporary, vulnerable. Even the air I breathed felt like it was on borrowed time, subject to his whim, his market analysis. There was a small framed photo on the table, Daniel and Sarah as children, sandy-haired, gap-toothed, beaming. I picked it up, my fingers tracing Daniel's face. What had happened to that boy? Where had that innocent joy gone? Had I missed something? Had I failed somewhere along the way? It's easy to blame yourself when faced with such profound disappointment. You sift through memories looking for the moment you went wrong, the conversation you should have had, the boundary you failed to set. But then another feeling began to stir, slow and steady, beneath the layers of hurt and self-doubt. A feeling born of resilience, forged in the fires of past hardships. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a quiet, simmering resolve. A refusal to be diminished, to be erased, to be treated as a mere line item on a balance sheet. I had weathered storms before. I had rebuilt my life from scratch more than once. I had learned through necessity to be resourceful, to be strong in ways I never thought I could be. Daniel saw me as old, perhaps, and dependent, easily managed. He saw me as someone whose useful life was over, whose only remaining purpose was to generate income for him. He had underestimated me deeply. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow or defeat. It was a tear of clarity. The game had changed. He had changed the rules, and I decided, in that quiet, still moment, that I would play by the new rule, but I would play to win. The days turned into weeks, each one punctuated by Daniel's polite but insistent inquiries about the first month's rent. He'd send a text, just checking in about the payment for the apartment, Mom, or leave a voicemail. His voice smooth, reasonable. Hope you're getting things sorted with the finances. Let me know if you have any questions about setting up the transfer. Questions? The only question I had was how he could look at himself in the mirror. His wife, Brenda, a woman whose saccharine sweetness always set my teeth on edge, even called once. "Oh, Marie, dear," she chirped, her voice dripping with faux concern. "We just wanted to make sure everything was okay with the rent. Daniel feels so terrible putting you out, but you know business is business, and this building is a significant investment for our future for the grandchildren." The grandchildren? Used as a cudgel, a justification. My grandchildren, who I adored, whose faces I longed to see more often, suddenly felt weaponized. Brenda's casual cruelty, masked by her syrupy tone, was almost worse than Daniel's bluntness. It spoke of a united front, of a shared disregard for the history we shared. They saw me as an obstacle, a burden, someone to be managed and milked. My financial situation was tight, tighter than I had let on even to Daniel when he helped me with the house sale funds. The investments he suggested weren't performing as well as he'd promised, and the bulk of the money was tied up, not easily accessible. I had a small amount in a separate savings account, money I had squirreled away over the years for emergencies, for something like this. I wasn't sure what I had saved it for, but it felt providential now, still. It wasn't enough to cover his exorbitant rent for long, not without drastically altering my already frugal lifestyle. I would have to choose between food and utilities, between medication and a roof over my head. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an eviction notice delivered by my own flesh and blood. I tried talking to Sarah. She was sympathetic, outraged on my behalf, but also stressed by her own financial pressures with young children. "Mom, that's just awful," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. I can't believe Daniel would do this. But she couldn't offer practical help. Not the kind I needed. Her husband, while kind, wasn't in a position to challenge Daniel, who had always been the more financially successful sibling, the one seen as the family's rising star. Talking to Sarah helped ease the emotional burden slightly, knowing she was on my side, but it didn't solve the core problem. I needed a solution, not just sympathy. The pressure mounted. Eviction notices have formal processes, timelines. Daniel, ever the businessman, was following them to the letter, or so he implied. The polite reminders became more frequent, the tone slightly less veiled. I could feel the noose tightening. It was during one particularly sleepless night, staring up at the ceiling of this apartment, feeling the weight of its ownership pressing down on me, that the idea, audacious and terrifying, began to form. It wasn't born of petty revenge. Not initially. It was born of desperation. Yes, but also of a deep-seated need to reclaim my dignity, to show Daniel and myself that I was not powerless, not just a number on his spreadsheet. I started small, quietly. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. I began researching property law, tenant rights, real estate markets. I spent hours at the public library, hunched over computers, feeling like a spy. The world of property ownership, of financing and negotiation, was alien to me. My life had been about nurturing, about creating a home, about the human connections within those walls, not the transactions that built or bought them. But necessity is a fierce teacher. I learned about LLCs, about commercial mortgages, about market valuations. I learned about the building itself, its history, its zoning, its ownership structure. Daniel owned it through a limited liability company, a shield. He'd explained proudly that protected his personal assets. I noted the name of the LLC. I learned that the building wasn't just apartments. It had commercial spaces on the ground floor, a small bookstore, a dry cleaner, a struggling little cafe. These tenants, I discovered through public records, paid their rent on time, reliably contributing to Daniel's income. They were cogs in his machine, just as he intended me to be. I felt a strange kinship with them, fellow tenants subject to his authority, his calculations. As I delved deeper, a bolder, more definitive plan took shape. It wasn't enough to just find another place to live, to escape his control. That would be surrender. That would still leave him believing he could treat me this way and face no consequence beyond my quiet disappearance. I needed to strike at the heart of his entitlement, at the very source of his perceived power over me. I needed to show him that the foundation he thought was so solid, the foundation built in part on my past sacrifices, could be shaken, could be bought. My research led me to a small, unassuming law office downtown, the kind that didn't advertise on billboards but relied on word of mouth. I'd found their name in a local business directory specializing in property law. I made an appointment under a false pretense, something about a will, because I was terrified of Daniel finding out what I was contemplating. Mr. Henderson was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes behind thick glasses and a quiet, steady demeanor. He listened patiently as I, my voice trembling slightly, laid out the situation, omitting at first the familial connection, framing it as a difficult landlord dispute. As I spoke about the exorbitant rent demand, the timing, the feeling of being trapped, his expression remained neutral, professional. But when I finally took a deep breath and told him who the landlord was, my son Daniel, his eyebrows rose fractionally, a subtle shift that acknowledged the true depth of the situation, without judgment. "Ha," he said softly. "That adds a layer." I then explained my research, the audacious idea that had taken root. I wanted to buy the building. Not a threat, not a negotiation tactic. I wanted to buy it. His initial reaction was a slow nod, followed by a thoughtful silence. He didn't dismiss me, didn't laugh, didn't tell me it was impossible. He treated my idea with the same seriousness he would any other client's complex legal matter. He asked about my finances, about the funds from the house sale, about my pension. He helped me navigate the tangled web of the investments Daniel had recommended, explaining the penalties for early withdrawal, the current market value. It was less than I'd hoped, certainly not enough to buy the building outright, which according to my research was valued at several $1,000,000. But it was a significant amount. Enough, Mr. Henderson explained. Potentially for a substantial down payment or leverage. He walked me through the process determining the building's true market value, assessing its income stream, the commercial and residential rents, exploring financing options, and, crucially, how to make an offer without revealing my identity to Daniels LLC until the absolute last moment. This was the most challenging part. Daniel was the sole owner of the LLC that held the building. Any offer would go through him. Mr. Henderson proposed using a blind trust, an anonymous entity that would make the offer on my behalf. It was complex, expensive, and offered no guarantee of success. Daniel wasn't actively looking to sell. Why would he? It was his cash cow, his symbol of success. We would have to make an offer so compelling, so financially attractive, that he couldn't refuse, or at least would have to consider seriously. This meant offering more than its market value, substantially more. This is where the sacrifice came in. The bulk of the money from the house, everything I had left after the initial investment, plus almost all of the small savings I had squirreled away. It felt like placing my entire future, my financial security, on a single high-stakes gamble. But the alternative, living under Daniel's thumb, facing potential homelessness at his hands, felt even bleaker. The process was slow, agonizingly so. Weeks turned into months. Mr. Henderson and his team worked diligently, compiling the offer, navigating the intricate legal steps required to maintain anonymity. Meanwhile, the pressure from Daniel continued. The polite reminders were replaced by more formal notices, a notice to pay rent or quit, taped to my door. It felt surreal, seeing official legal documents served by my own son. I showed them to Mr. Henderson. He advised me on how to respond legally, ensuring I wasn't signing away any rights, buying me time without giving Daniel any hint that I wasn't simply struggling to find the money or another place to live. The stress was immense. I lost sleep. My appetite waned. Every time the doorbell rang, I flinched, expecting Daniel or someone acting on his behalf. I still had to interact with him occasionally. Brief, strained encounters in the hallway, polite nods, meaningless small talk. He'd ask, "Any luck finding a new place, Mom?" Or, "Have you sorted out the rent?" I would simply say, "I was working on it," keeping my voice flat, revealing nothing. The internal contrast between the quiet, seemingly helpless woman he saw and the whirlwind of complex financial and legal maneuvering happening secretly behind the scenes was a constant source of tension, and I admit, a growing sense of grim satisfaction. He saw me as weak, as an easy mark. He had no idea the forces I had set in motion, the quiet storm gathering momentum just beyond his privileged sight. He had underestimated the resilience of a woman who had built a life from very little, who had faced down far greater adversaries than a calculating son. He thought he held all the cards, that his ownership of this building gave him absolute power. He was about to learn that sometimes the tenant knows more about the foundation than the landlord. The waiting felt endless. Every phone call, every email, every piece of mail felt charged with potential news. Mr. Henderson was a calm presence, managing my expectations while quietly pushing forward. The offer had been formally submitted through the blind trust. Now it was up to Daniel. Would he even consider it? Would he see through the anonymity? Would his greed outweigh his desire to retain control? The offer we made was deliberately high, a premium well above the building's assessed value. Mr. Henderson believed it was high enough to make Daniel pause, to make him consider the profit, perhaps even against his own long-term plans for the property. Daniel, after all, was ultimately motivated by money. That was the one thing I knew with chilling certainty about the man my son had become. He responded, eventually, not directly to the blind trust, but through his own lawyer. It was a counteroffer, a higher price still, but not by an astronomical amount. It indicated he was interested, that the number had piqued his business sense. It also showed his own audacity, trying to squeeze even more out of the deal. Mr. Henderson advised me. It was a strong sign. He was negotiating. He didn't know it was me. Of course, but he was negotiating the sale of his building. The sheer, breathtaking irony of the situation was not lost on me. My son, who saw me as a financial burden, was now potentially going to make a significant profit by selling me the very asset he was using to extract money from me. We countered, coming back slightly but still well above the initial market value. This negotiation process took more time, each back and forth feeling like a tightening coil in my chest. I still had to live in the building, still had to navigate the awkward encounters with Daniel. He seemed slightly distracted during this period, perhaps preoccupied with the anonymous offer. He stopped asking about the rent quite as often, which was a small mercy, though the underlying threat remained. I paid a small symbolic amount of rent for 1 month, something just enough to show I wasn't abandoning the tenancy, but not the full amount he demanded. Mr. Henderson advised this was a good strategy to maintain my legal standing as a tenant while the purchase negotiations were underway. It felt perverse, handing a check to my son, knowing what I was planning. He accepted it, with a curt nod, back in full landlord mode. I wondered what he would do if the purchase fell through. Would he escalate the eviction? Would he feel smug about having forced me to pay something? The tension was a constant hum beneath the surface of my life. I couldn't share it with Sarah. The potential for disappointment was too great, and I didn't want to burden her further. I was on this path alone, with only Mr. Henderson as my confidant. He was a rock, steady and reassuring, guiding me through the complex legal and financial landscape. He connected me with a commercial mortgage broker, a sharp woman named Maria, who specialized in financing for unconventional clients, as she put it politely. Getting the financing was another hurdle. My age, my limited income, beyond the investments, the large sum required, it all presented challenges. But Maria was creative and persistent. She saw the value in the building's rental income stream and believed in the soundness of the investment, regardless of the emotional context. It wasn't personal for her, it was business. A stark contrast to Daniel, who had made business intensely personal. We secured the financing, conditional on the sale going through, another layer of the plan falling into place. Each step forward felt momentous, yet terrifying. There was still so much that could go wrong. Daniel could change his mind. The financing could fall through. My identity could be revealed prematurely, potentially causing him to back out or retaliate. The secrecy was paramount. I continued my quiet life in the ground floor apartment, observing the rhythms of the building I was trying to buy, the tenants who would become my own. I watched Daniel come and go, often in his expensive car, looking every bit the successful businessman. He seemed oblivious, arrogant in his certainty that he was in control. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the ground floor apartment, the mother he deemed a financial drain, was about to shift the earth beneath his feet. The day the offer was formally accepted felt surreal. Mr. Henderson called me. He signed, he said, his voice calm. The purchase agreement is executed. I sat down heavily on the nearest chair, my legs suddenly weak. It was happening. After months of research, secrecy, and agonizing tension, the impossible was becoming real. The building was mine, or rather, it was under contract to become mine. There were still steps to finalize: inspections, appraisals, locking in the mortgage, the final closing. But the crucial hurdle had been cleared. Daniel had agreed to sell his building to an anonymous buyer represented by a blind trust. His greed had won. The purchase price was astronomical, certainly more than I ever thought I'd spend on anything. It would leave me with very little liquid cash, tied up almost entirely in this asset. It was a gamble, a huge, life-altering gamble. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for myself, about reclaiming the dignity he had tried to strip away. It was about proving that I wasn't disposable, wasn't a burden, wasn't just a problem to be solved with a rent demand. The final weeks leading up to the closing were a blur of paperwork, meetings with Mr. Henderson and Maria, the mortgage broker, and the continued, almost unbearable secrecy. I had to continue interacting with Daniel, the signed purchase agreement tucked away in Mr. Henderson's office, a ticking time bomb between us. He occasionally mentioned the sale, vaguely, saying he was considering an offer on the building, never hinting at the identity of the buyer. He seemed pleased with himself, talking about reinvesting the proceeds into something even bigger, even better. He was already counting his chicken. I would nod, offer non-committal responses, my heart hammering in my chest. It was a performance, a carefully constructed facade of ignorance and vulnerability. The physical closing was a quiet affair, held in Mr. Henderson's office with just us and representatives from the bank and title company. Daniel was not present. His lawyer handled the transaction on his behalf. It felt strangely anticlimactic. After months of internal drama, signing the papers, transferring the funds, receiving the keys to the building, it all happened with a bureaucratic calmness that belied the seismic shift it represented in my life. And in Daniel's. I owned it. The building where my son had demanded rent from his mother. The building he had used as a tool of control and financial extraction. It was now legally and financially mine. The moment felt heavy, complex. There wasn't pure joy or triumphant vindication. There was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, a profound sadness that it had come to this, mixed with a quiet, steely resolve. What mother wants to hurt her child? No matter how old they are, no matter how much they've hurt her. But Daniel had left me no choice. He had forced me into a corner, and in fighting my way out, I had had to use the very tools he valued most. Money, ownership, power. I left Mr. Henderson's office with a thick folder of documents and a set of keys that felt impossibly heavy in my hand. The building stood just a few blocks away. I decided to walk. As I approached, I looked up at its facade, the rows of windows, the storefronts on the ground level. It no longer looked like Daniel's building. It looked like my building, a building I had bought, against all odds, to defend myself against my own son. The air felt different around it, now charged with a new significance. I walked past the small cafe, the dry cleaner, the bookstore. The people inside, the tenants, were now my responsibility. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about them too. It was about the building itself, a physical entity that represented a turning point, a battleground, and now, potentially a new beginning. I had the keys. I had the power. The next step was the hardest one. Telling Daniel, the confrontation I had both dreaded and planned for was now imminent. How would he react when he discovered the anonymous buyer, the one who paid a premium, was the mother he had tried to evict? The thought sent a tremor through me. The inversion of power was complete. The son who had demanded rent from his mother would now discover his mother was his landlord. The stage was set. I waited a few days after the closing, allowing the dust to settle on the legal side of things, allowing myself a moment to simply hold the knowledge, to feel the weight of it. Daniel called, sounding upbeat. "The money came through today, Mom," he said, cheerfully oblivious. "Everything's finalized. Pretty sweet deal. Made a nice profit. I'm thinking of looking at a complex further uptown. Even bigger." His casual satisfaction was like a physical blow. He was celebrating the profit he made from selling me his building, completely unaware it was me. It hardened my resolve. There would be no gentle way to do this. I asked him to come over to my apartment that evening, saying I needed to talk to him about the rent. He agreed readily, probably expecting me to beg for an extension, or confess I still couldn't pay. He arrived promptly at 7 p.m., dressed in a casual shirt, looking relaxed and confident. Brenda wasn't with him. Good. This needed to be between us. He sat in the same chair he'd occupied when he first delivered his rent demand. The room felt smaller, charged with unspoken history and the explosive truth I held within me. "So, Mom," he said, leaning back, a hint of impatience in his tone. Have you figured things out?" I looked at him, at his expectant face, the face of the man who was my son, and yet a stranger. I took a deep breath. This was it. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I figured things out. I reached for the folder I had placed on the coffee table, the one containing the building's deed, the mortgage documents, the formal transfer papers. His eyes followed my movement, a flicker of curiosity replacing his smug expectation. I opened the folder and slid a single document across the table towards him. It was the new deed, clearly listing the owner as Marie Dubois, my full name. His gaze dropped to the paper. I watched his face as he read it. The casual smile faded. His eyes widened, scanning the document, then flicking back to my face, searching, disbelieving. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and stunned. He picked up the paper, his hand trembling now, holding it closer, as if the words might change with a second look. He read it again, and then a third time. The silence stretched, thick, with his dawning comprehension.
What?
Knight, what is this? He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the deed for this building, Daniel, I said calmly. As you can see, it's in my name now. He stared at me, utterly speechless. The shock was profound, complete. His mind was clearly racing, trying to connect the dots. The anonymous offer, the quick sale, the fact that I was still living here, still talking about rent. But the buyer, kinda suspensiase, finally managed, his voice regaining some strength, though it was laced with disbelief and a rising note of panic. The blind trust. Quite to doubt that you. I met his gaze directly. Yes, Daniel, that was me. The air crackled with the revelation. He slumped back in the chair, the paper falling onto his lap, as if he couldn't hold it anymore. His mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. The sophisticated businessman facade had crumbled completely, revealing the stunned, disoriented person beneath. The power dynamic had inverted with brutal speed and finality. Just moments ago, he was the landlord, the owner, the one in control, expecting to discuss my failure to pay. Now, I was the owner, the landlord, and he was Singh. What? The son who had demanded rent from his mother only to discover she had bought his building. The irony was a sharp, bittersweet taste in my mouth. It wasn't the triumphant moment I might have imagined in my darkest moments of anger. It was heavy, laced with the sadness of witnessing the consequences of his own actions laid bare before him. He had pushed me to this, forced my hand. He had treated me as a transaction, and I had responded in kind, but on a scale he could never have anticipated. He had sought to profit from my need, and I had used his own asset, bought with resources I had helped provide, to reclaim my autonomy. He finally found his voice again, but it was choked with a mixture of anger and confusion. How? How did you do this? Where did you get the money? His eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding the shock. The money from the house. Gosh, you didn't invest it all, did you? You held back? You lied to me? His mind immediately went to betrayal, to calculated deceit, because that was the world he understood, the way he operated. He couldn't conceive of me acting out of anything other than similar self-interest or hidden motives. I didn't lie, Daniel, I said, my voice still quiet. I used the money from the house sale. Yes, every last bit that wasn't tied up in the investments you recommended, plus almost all of my savings. And I took out a very large mortgage. It cost me everything I had, and then some, to buy this building. I paused, letting that sink in. Because you demanded rent from me, because you treated me like a stranger, a burden, because you forgot everything I had done for you, everything I had sacrificed, and reduced our relationship to a business transaction. His face contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. But why would you do this? Why spend all that money? You could have just found another place. Could I? I challenged softly. On my pension? Facing potential eviction from my own son. You left me very few options, Daniel, and none of them felt like living with any dignity. I leaned forward slightly. You wanted fairness? You wanted everyone to pay their way? Fine. I bought the building. Now we can talk about fairness. Now we can talk about paying the market rate. I picked up another document. A standard lease agreement. Effective immediately, the rent for this apartment will be significantly higher than what you proposed. It will be the true market rate, plus a premium for the inconvenience you've caused me. I slid the lease across the table. It was a high number, certainly more than he could have afforded for this small ground floor unit. Even with his income, it was a number calculated to make a point, not just to extract money. His eyes fixed on the figure, and his face went even paler. "But you can't do this," he stammered. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice gaining strength, a quiet power filling the room. "I can. I own the building now. I am your landlord." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at the lease agreement, then back at me, his face a mask of disbelief and outrage. The transformation from the polished businessman who had arrived earlier to the sputtering, cornered individual before me was stark. You tricked me," he finally exploded, his voice loud, raw with fury. "You played some kind of game. You let me think you were just some old woman struggling, and all the while you were plotting this." "I didn't trick you, Daniel," I replied calmly, though my heart was pounding. "I simply acted. You showed me how you saw our relationship, as a transaction. You introduced the concept of market rates and fairness, based on ownership. I merely followed your lead. You own, you set the terms. Well, now I own." He surged to his feet, pacing the small living room. "But the money, the profit, you let me sell it to you for a profit. You paid more than it was worth." The irony of him complaining about the profit he had just made possible by my actions, was almost comical, but the tension in the room was too high for humor. "That was the cost of doing business, Daniel," I said, using his own language. "The cost of reclaiming my independence. You set the price, and I met it. You valued your profit over who the buyer was. That was your choice." "My choice?" he scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know it was you. If I'd known, I never would have sold." "Precisely," I said. "Because you wanted control. You wanted to believe you held all the power. You thought I was a problem you could solve with a rent demand and an eviction notice if necessary. You never imagined I would challenge you on your own terms in your own world." His anger intensified. "This is insane. This is crazy. What are you going to do? Are you going to evict me from my own office space upstairs? Are you going to kick out all the tenants? Are you going to ruin me?" "Your office space is part of the building," I acknowledged. "And yes, you are now a tenant, subject to the terms of your lease, just like everyone else. As for the other tenants, no, they pay their rent. They are not the issue. You are." I paused, letting that sink in. "And I have no intention of ruining you, Daniel. I simply intend to live here, in my building, without being extorted by my own son. As for your office lease, we can discuss the terms when it comes up for renewal. I assure you, the new market rates apply." He stared at me, his eyes blazing. "You did this out of spite? Out of revenge? Is it spite to defend myself?" I asked, my voice rising slightly, finally allowing some of the banked emotion to surface. "Is it revenge to refuse to be walked over? You pushed me to the brink, Daniel. You treated me with a callousness I never thought possible for my own child. You saw me not as your mother, but as an inconvenience, a financial problem. You put a price on the roof over my head, the roof I helped you afford in the first place. You taught me a harsh lesson about the value you place on our relationship. I simply learned the lesson and applied it." He was shaking his head, still unable to fully grasp the reality. "Brenda is going to kill me. She's going to absolutely kill me." His immediate thought went to his wife, to the consequences he would face from her, not to the profound hurt he had inflicted on me, or the catastrophic impact this had on our relationship. It was another small, sharp confirmation of his priorities. "That's between you and Brenda," I said, my voice hardening. "My concern is this building, and my life in it. You demanded rent. I bought the building and raised it. Not just your rent for this apartment, but the standard for how you treat people, how you treat me. This wasn't about revenge, Daniel. It was about self-preservation. It was about drawing a line in the sand. You crossed it first. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, with years of buried dynamics suddenly exposed. He looked at me, not with the cold calculation he'd shown before, but with raw, stunned anger. He was trapped. His asset was gone, sold to the very person he had sought to control, who now held the reins of power, even over his own presence in the building. He couldn't argue with the legal documents, couldn't deny the signatures. He had done this to himself. He turned away abruptly, stalking towards the door. "I can't deal with this right now," he muttered, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "We'll talk later." "There's not much more to talk about, Daniel," I said as he reached the door. "The building is sold. I am the owner. Consider this your formal notification of the change in ownership, and your new rent statement will be delivered on the 1st of the month." He paused, his hand on the doorknob, his back to me. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice low and bitter. "No, Daniel," I replied, my voice clear and strong. "You did that yourself. I just finally decided not to let you ruin me too." He left, without another word, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving a silence that felt different from the heavy silence before. The silence felt lighter, cleaner, even though it was tinged with the profound sadness of a broken bond. He was gone. His power over me evaporated with the final signatures on the deed. I was left standing in my apartment, no longer feeling like a tenant on borrowed time, but like the owner, the one in control. The victory wasn't sweet, but it was mine. Hard won, costly, and solitary, but mine. The fallout was immediate and messy. Daniel's fury, once unleashed, spread like wildfire through the family. Sarah was shocked when I told her, though she quickly understood why I had done it. "Oh, Mom," she cried, her voice full of sympathy and a touch of awe. "I can't believe you actually did it. Good for you. But how is Daniel taking it? How is he taking it?" He was incandescent with rage. He called, not to discuss, but to hurl accusations. He accused me of being deceitful, manipulative, of bankrupting myself out of spite. He couldn't see past the financial transaction, couldn't comprehend the emotional landscape that had driven me. His calls were punctuated by Brenda's shrill voice in the background, adding fuel to the fire. Brenda seemed even more incensed than Daniel, perhaps because the sudden disappearance of his significant asset impacted their joint financial future, the one built on their smart investments. She called me separately, her usual syrupy tone replaced by a venomous edge. "Marie, how could you? Do you know what this does to us? To our plans? Daniel is devastated. You've destroyed his business, his reputation. His business, his reputation? I had bought one building." The implication that this single act had annihilated his entire life's work was a testament to how much this building, this symbol of his ownership and power, meant to him. "Brenda," I said, cutting her off, my voice calm but firm. "Daniel chose to sell the building. He chose the price. He chose to demand rent from his mother. These were his decisions." I simply responded. "Responded?" she shrieked. "You ambushed him. You blindsided him. You spent all your money on this old building just to get back at him." "I spent my money that came significantly from the sale of the house where I raised your husband, to ensure I had a place to live with dignity," I corrected. He forced my hand. The conversation devolved from there, a tangled mess of accusations and bitter recriminations. It became clear that in their minds, I was the villain, the irrational, spiteful old woman who had sabotaged her son's success. There was no acknowledgement of the hurt they had inflicted, no introspection on why I might have been driven to such an extreme measure. Their narrative was simple. I was wrong. They were the victims. The family fractured along predictable lines. Some distant relatives, always more aligned with Daniel's idea of success and prosperity, whispered their disapproval. Others, those who knew my history, who had seen the quiet sacrifices I had made over the years, offered tentative support, often in hushed tones, afraid of Daniel's reaction. Sarah remained steadfastly on my side, though even her support was strained by the sheer drama of it all, and the impact on her relationship with her brother. It was isolating, this victory. It had come at a steep price, not just financially, but relationally. The silence from Daniel was the most painful. After the initial explosion, he stopped calling. Brenda occasionally sent icy texts, relaying his displeasure or making passive-aggressive remarks about my supposed financial ruin. It was as if I had become a non-person to him, an obstacle removed, a chapter he wanted to close and forget. Yet, I still lived in his building, in the apartment he had intended to charge me market rent for. Now, it was my building. I had sent him the formal rent statement for the apartment, the one with the significantly raised figure. He hadn't responded, hadn't paid. He was technically my tenant now, in this small apartment and in his office space upstairs. The irony continued to stack up. What would I do? Evict my own son? The thought was a heavy one. It wasn't about the money anymore. Not really. It was about the principle, the power dynamic that had shifted so dramatically. It was about the consequence of his actions. I didn't want to destroy him, but I couldn't let him think there were no consequences for treating people, particularly his mother, with such disregard. This building, once his symbol of power, was now mine, a tangible representation of the line I had drawn. And as I walked through the hallways, greeted the other tenants who were now my tenants, I felt a strange sense of purpose settling in. I hadn't just bought a building, I had bought my freedom, my dignity, and a future I would now build on my own terms. Being the owner was more than just a title on a piece of paper. It was a responsibility. The initial shock and drama surrounding the purchase slowly subsided, leaving me with the day-to-day reality of managing a property. There were leaky faucets to fix, tenant complaints to address, maintenance schedules to manage. This was a world far removed from the life I had known, the life centered around raising children and managing a household. But I approached it with the same quiet determination I had applied to everything else in my life. I hired a local property manager, a capable young woman named Maria, different from the mortgage broker, though it felt like a sign, who knew the building and its tenants well. She handled the daily operations, collecting rents, coordinating repairs. It freed me to focus on the bigger picture, on understanding the building's finances, its potential, its needs. I walked through the building regularly, talking to the commercial tenants, the bookstore owner, the woman who ran the dry cleaner, the young couple struggling to keep their cafe afloat. They had all been tenants under Daniel, and they had stories of sudden rent increases, of delayed repairs, of a landlord who saw them primarily as sources of income, not as people running businesses, contributing to the neighborhood. There was a sense of cautious optimism among them. With the change in ownership, they didn't know the history, of course, didn't know their new landlord was the former tenant from the ground floor, Daniel's mother, but they hoped for better. Their hopes became a new purpose for me. This wasn't just about my fight with Daniel anymore. It was about creating a stable, supportive environment for these people who relied on this building for their livelihoods, for their homes. I started small. I met with each commercial tenant individually, listening to their concerns. I didn't lower the rent drastically. The mortgage payments were substantial, and I needed the income stream. But I offered more flexible terms, agreed to overdue repairs they had been requesting for months under Daniel's ownership, and committed to investing in the building's upkeep. I wanted to be a different kind of landlord, one who saw the people, not just the profit. The residential tenants too saw changes, quicker responses to maintenance requests, a more visible and approachable owner through Maria, the property manager. It wasn't long before word spread, quietly, through the building and the neighborhood, that things were different under the new owner. Better. This work, this focus on the practicalities of running the building, was grounding. It pulled me out of the emotional maelstrom of the confrontation with Daniel. It gave me something tangible to build, something positive to focus on. It was a form of healing. Daniel remained distant. He continued to ignore my rent statements for the apartment and his office space. His lawyer contacted Mr. Henderson, attempting to negotiate some kind of settlement, a way for Daniel to buy back the building. or at least recoup some of his perceived loss. Mr. Henderson politely but firmly declined. The building was not for sale. Not to Daniel, not to anyone. It represented too much. As for the unpaid rent, I instructed Mr. Henderson to handle it legally, just as Daniel would have. Notices were sent. The process for pursuing the debt began. It felt cold, transactional, the very thing I had resented in Daniel. But it was necessary. There had to be consequences. He couldn't simply pretend this hadn't happened, couldn't walk away from the new reality he had created. The irony of suing my son for unpaid rent in a building I bought from him was a heavy weight, but it was a consequence of his own actions. He had shown me that relationships could be reduced to legal and financial terms, and I was applying the lesson. Living in the building, now as its owner, felt different. The air no longer felt borrowed. The walls no longer felt like part of a cage. They were my walls now, the roof over my head secured by my own hand, my own resourcefulness. I still felt the pang of sadness over the broken relationship with Daniel, the son I had loved unconditionally, who had wounded me so deeply. But the sting of betrayal was less sharp, dulled by the quiet satisfaction of having overcome, of having refused to be defeated. This building wasn't just an investment, it was a monument to resilience, to unexpected strength, to the quiet power of a woman underestimated. The legal process with Daniel regarding the unpaid rent was slow and draining. As legal processes tend to be, it felt absurd, using lawyers and court documents to communicate with my own son, but it was the only way he seemed willing to engage. His lawyer argued various technicalities, attempting to dispute the validity of the lease agreement I had presented him with after the purchase. But the papers were sound, drawn up by Mr. Henderson, perfectly legal. The fact remained, he had occupied the apartment and his office space after the change in ownership, and he hadn't paid rent. His attempt to fight it felt like a last-ditch effort to regain some semblance of control, to avoid acknowledging the full extent of the inversion that had occurred. It was a painful, drawn-out reminder of the chasm that had opened between us. Meanwhile, life in the building continued. I oversaw renovations in some of the common areas, investing some of the rental income back into the property. The building was old and needed work, but there was a satisfaction in repairing and improving something that was truly mine. I found myself talking to the tenants more often, getting to know their lives, their businesses. The woman at the dry cleaner, Mrs. Rodriguez, shared stories about raising her own children, the sacrifices she had made to build her business. The young couple at the cafe, Lena and Sam, talked about their dreams and struggles. These connections, born out of shared space and mutual reliance, felt like a balm. They were relationships built on respect and open communication, a stark contrast to the transactional interactions Daniel had preferred. One afternoon, several months after the closing, I was in the small courtyard behind the building, overseeing the planting of some new flowers. Mrs. Rodriguez came out, taking a break. "You know, Marie," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "this building feels different now. It feels, Scout, cared for, like someone actually lives here, not just owns it from afar." I smiled. "I do live here, Mrs. Rodriguez." She knew I lived on the ground floor, but she didn't know the whole story. "It makes a difference," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the courtyard. "Under the old owner, well, he was never around, and things fell into disrepair. It felt like he only cared about the rent check." Her words, simple and direct, validated everything I had done. They underscored the difference between ownership as pure extraction and ownership as stewardship. The building wasn't just a collection of units generating income, it was a community, a place where people lived and worked. My investment wasn't just financial, it was emotional, personal. The lawsuit for unpaid rent finally reached a point where a court date was set. Daniel was required to appear. I dreaded it. The formality of a courtroom amplifying the unnaturalness of our situation. But I knew I had to see it through. This wasn't just about the money he owed, it was about the culmination of the boundary I had drawn, the consequence he had to face for his actions. On the day of the hearing, I saw Daniel across the courtroom. He looked strained, thinner, the easy confidence he once wore replaced by a brittle tension. Brenda was with him, her face set in a hard, resentful line. We didn't speak. We didn't make eye contact. The air between us was glacial. The hearing itself was mercifully brief. The judge reviewed the documents, the undisputed facts of ownership change and non-payment. Daniel's lawyer presented their arguments, which mostly amounted to trying to portray the situation as an unusual, emotionally driven family dispute, rather than a straightforward landlord-tenant issue. Mr. Henderson calmly presented the legal facts. Ownership transfer. Rent was due. Rent was not paid. The judge ruled quickly. Finding in my favor, Daniel was ordered to pay the back rent owed for both the apartment and his office space. It was a victory on paper, a legal affirmation of my position. But looking at Daniel's face as the judge delivered the ruling, seeing the mix of anger, humiliation, and defeat, the victory felt hollow. It was the end of a legal battle, but not the end of the emotional one. The silence in the courtroom after the ruling was heavy with the weight of our broken relationship. He had lost the building, and he had lost the legal fight over the consequences. He had pushed too hard, taken too much for granted, and the repercussions were now undeniable. As we left the courtroom, walking separate paths, I felt a profound sadness settle over me. I had won. I had reclaimed my dignity and secured my future, but the cost was etched in the pained, furious face of my son. This building, this hard-won asset, would always carry that weight, that bittersweet reminder of the battle I had to fight against the very person I had once fought for. Above all else, life settled into a new rhythm. The building thrived under attentive management. The commercial tenants renewed their leases, some expanding their spaces. The residential units were fully occupied, generating the income needed to service the mortgage and cover expenses, with a little left over for ongoing improvements. The building, once a source of tension and conflict, had become a source of stability and purpose. I continued to live in the ground floor apartment. It no longer felt small or temporary. It felt like home, a secure base from which to manage the property and live my life. I spent my days overseeing renovations, meeting with tenants, working with Maria, the property manager. It was demanding work, but it was fulfilling. It was building something, nurturing something, in a way that felt right. Daniel eventually paid the judgment for the back rent, not directly, but through his lawyer. It was a purely financial transaction, devoid of any personal contact. The money sat in a separate account, a grim reminder of the legal battle. He moved his office out of the building shortly after, quietly, without fanfare. I heard later that he had found a new space in a different part of town. I didn't see him, didn't speak to him. The silence between us stretched, long and heavy. Sarah visited occasionally, often bringing her children. She tried, gently, to bridge the gap, suggesting I reach out to Daniel, suggesting he might be ready to talk, but the wounds were too deep, the silence too ingrained. He hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged the pain he had caused. He had simply been defeated, and in his defeat, he had withdrawn completely. It hurt, of course. It hurt like hell. Every milestone missed, every holiday without his presence, was a fresh reminder of the break. But the raw, desperate pain had faded, replaced by a dull ache, a permanent scar. I had protected myself. Yes, I had stood up for myself, and won, but the victory was not without its profound loss. The building itself became a source of quiet strength. Walking its hallways, seeing the improvements, talking to the people who lived and worked there, it was a constant affirmation of my capabilities, my resilience. I had taken a situation meant to diminish me and turned it into a platform for my own empowerment. I had been forced into a battle I never wanted to fight, but in fighting it, I had discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed. I thought about the symbolic objects in the JSON profile, the house, the pet, the photo. The house was gone, transformed into the funds that bought this building. There was no pet, The photo of Daniel and Sarah as children still sat on my table. I looked at it sometimes. A relic of a different time, a different Daniel. It felt like looking at a stranger. The inversion of the power dynamic was complete, and it had fundamentally changed everything. Daniel, the son who had sought to control his mother through ownership and finance, was now outside, while his mother, the one he had deemed a burden, was inside. The owner, the steward. It was a complex, bittersweet ending to that chapter of our lives. I was independent, secure, and quietly powerful, but I was also estranged from my son. It was not the future I would have chosen, but it was the future I had built for myself, piece by painstaking piece. In the aftermath of betrayal, the building stood tall, solid, a testament to resilience, a silent witness to the battle fought and won within its wall. And I, its owner, looked out at the world from my ground floor apartment, no longer defined by the role of mother betrayed, but by the quiet strength of a woman who had bought her own freedom, brick by expensive brick. There was a sense of peace now, hard-won and fragile, the peace of knowing I had faced down a profound challenge and emerged, though scarred, unbroken. The dark part of the story was the betrayal, the necessity of fighting my own child. The redemptive part was the reclaiming of myself, the building of something new and solid on the rubble of what was broken. The building was more than just property. It was my anchor, my achievement, my quiet rebellion turned into a secure foundation. My life was different now, not easier, but mine, and that in itself was everything.